A nation in turmoil, divided, on the brink of a civil war. Some say, the issues that divide us, we're picking sides and ready to defend our positions to the end. Some are pro-life. Most, if not all, are pro-choice. But when it comes to cashing in all your chips at the end of your trip to that big riverboat casino in the sky, you better hope you've not only lived a life that is pro-choice, heck, you better hope you've been a pro at making choices, folks. Throughout this 4-part series, Selling Our Souls, I've been exploring the idea that every opinion we take on has deeper, more spiritual consequences, and that those opinions are inherently flawed by influence and bias before we even think of having them. It's this constant karmatic battle between right and wrong, good and evil, and finding that Goldilocks sweet spot right in the middle, riding the fence of social atrocities. I mean, if we're going to take a side, how do we choose which side to take? After all, up to this point in Overthinking Everything, I've deconstructed some of the political culture of cultism to answer why we do allow ourselves to be herded in to these either-or sheep pens of opinion, dividing us, separating us, and leaving the pack vulnerable to those predators stalking easy prey. God grant me the serenity, right? If you're a drinker, you might have heard that prayer said a few times. It's all about surrendering to what you can't control and focusing more on what you can. This series is similar. I'm trying to dispel some of the myths, mistruths, and flat-out lies we've been told, but focusing on our part in that more than the powers that be. Vote or revolt to change the system. How do we change ourselves? We must start by looking inward. Mindfulness. We're coming up on a series of episodes that will help put a finer point on this. In this Selling Our Souls finale, we're sending out the SOS for help in how we should have answered some of our biggest moral dilemmas of the last few generations. The biggest and most controversial topics that we've all thought about. Those scandals and stories that have rocked our foundations and split our relationships. I'm giving you the answers to the test here, kiddos. I broke into the teacher's desk, got the answer key. So get your pens out, jot the answers on your forearm so you can pull up your sleeves, take a peek when you need to when you get stumped. I want us all to pass. I'm not competitive. We can all get straight A's. Or bi A's, gay A's, lesbian A's, trans A's, pan A's, or for the conservatives out there, mayonnaise. I'm bringing us all back around to pro-choice because we need to be pros at choices. We need to make better choices, and we need to know how. Remember that no one is accountable for your soul more than you. I just don't think you get to final judgment, to the end, if that's your thing. And St. Peter says, oh, dude, you voted for Trump? And you're like, yeah, but it was a cult. I got sucked in. And they're like, oh, well, in that case, I guess it's all okay. Remember, the whole book started over one principle: free will, pro-choice. We have choices. We just make the wrong choices often because of ego, pride, emotion, or ignorance. When it comes to choosing your own adventure in life, I'll quote Henry David Thoreau. There's a path you take and a path not taken. Choice is up to you, my friends. An open road and a road that's hidden. A brand new life around the bend. Wait. Stop, scratch that. That is not Thoreau. That's the theme song to Who's the Boss. Welcome to the podcast. In future episodes, I'll discuss more how we're the sum of all our parts and how that human mathematical equation is built on one key factor more than any other: perspective. Both in how we see the world and the perspective we obtain through how others see the world. It's cyclical. Our perspective impacts how we will see others in this world. But obtaining those other perspectives alters our perspective in how we see the world. Our perspective then becomes more like a kaleidoscope versus a telescope. For some, if their heads are buried, maybe a periscope. Overthinkers, like me, maybe a microscope. Either way, perspective prepares us for pragmatism, in that it becomes easier for us to check our pride, ego, and biases at the door when forming opinions, because there's this constant reminder that the world does not revolve around us. Isn't that a hard pill to swallow? How everything we believe in is centered around us. Seriously, if you need to pause this and just consider it for a few seconds, that's fine. What opinion do you have on any given issue that isn't about you? Congratulations if you found one. You're clearly a critical thinker, among other things. But no matter how evolved, I'm sure there are some issues that we pick sides on because they do involve us. Sometimes it really is all about us. We can't help that. Part of pragmatism is running everything through this filter I'm talking about in this episode, filtering out your own prejudices, your own biases to ensure your opinion is centered, grounded, and altruistic. So before we get into the answering the biggest moral dilemmas thing, let's discuss those big words. We've talked about prejudice and bias. This whole series is about opinions. But centered, grounded, and altruistic. We don't often consider these words in relation to forming an opinion, do we? After all, in the heat of a moment of having an opinion, do we even really consider much at all? Centered and grounded can be synonyms. Here, I use them almost like a graph. Centered, your east and west. Grounded, your north and south, the XY axis stuff. That's the centered is your baseline, right here. It's not the middle or moderate centrist ideology. Making sure you are centered or your opinion is centered doesn't mean centrist. It doesn't mean compromising what you believe in to others. It means compromising for others. Does your opinion on whatever subject take into consideration the ramifications on others? Are you looking at the biggest picture possible first, then stepping closer? We often talk about stepping back and taking a look at the big picture. This is about training our brains to default to the bigger picture and then narrow in on the specifics once we assess the vital information. We talk about centered in the sense that you're not too hot, you're not too cold, you're Goldilocks. Just right. And when you practice this, you'll be right a lot more. Correct right, not domestic terror threat right. Grounded. This might be a trigger word if your parents were strict or you were an asshole growing up. But don't worry, no one's taking your Nintendo or your phone, whichever generation you belong to. Grounded simply means your feet are firmly planted on the ground of reality for the opinions you espouse. Look, no one knows the struggles of unrealistic opinions more than me, right? And hyperbole. It's easy to react with the any given issue, with this pie-in-the-sky perspective, this utopian answer for all of life's ills, but we just can't do that. It's okay to have that idea. We have to be careful of allowing that to infect our opinions too much. And the reason is, we must operate within the structure of stretching our current paradigm, right? Without expecting everyone else to just be okay with blowing it up. For example, we are a capitalist economy and a consumerist society. Personally, I believe those two things aren't entirely positive traits. Expecting America and Americans to tomorrow just be something else is unrealistic, and it impedes the discussion of realistic progress. But that holds with every issue and opinion. I'm not saying lower your standards or expectations. I'm saying craft our opinions around workable, realistic solutions rather than these unattainable ideals. Hopes and dreams are essential, and having those thoughts, thinking in those ways, of how we can smash an issue and reconstruct it so it makes much better sense to everyone is how we progress and move forward and evolve. That is deconstruction. However, prudence prevails, promoting progress. Progress is just new ideas. Prudence is what prevents us from making early mistakes that might derail that progress, thus making it harder for us to sell our ideas as workable solutions. Think about a time where you worked so hard to convince someone of something. You're trying to get them to try something, okay? And when they tried it, it was a disappointment. You built this thing up, and then it didn't deliver. I can think of movies, music, all kinds of things, food experiences. I go to a restaurant. I have a great experience. I tell everyone. Then I finally talk someone into going and trying it, and we go, and it's just, meh. They're not going to be really excited to give it another try, you know? Trust me, this really was good. Maybe it was a bad night. Or maybe I had the rare good night. Either way, your opportunity is passed for that first impression. Prudence promotes progress. Go back to the drawing board before the product hits the market, so to speak. Same with our opinions. It ensures that when you do present your idea, there's a better chance of success and the doubters embracing that new idea. Who can argue with success, right? Altruistic. This is quite possibly the most difficult to achieve. Altruism, the act of unselfishness, the selflessness, compassion, empathy. This sense that what I do because it needs to be done, not because I need to be seen doing it. Remember earlier in this Selling Our Soul series when I spoke about the performative nature of public prayer? Well, it's because I doubt the altruism behind the act. Now, not all religions are the same, as we'll get into in the next episodes, where I'll discuss more how spiritually similar we all are. Throughout this season of Overthinking Everything, with the theme of deconstructing a culture of cultism, we're talking a lot about toxic white Southern culture. Southern could also mean rural in this context, but historically and anthropologically, this is Southern culture, regardless of the geography. And a big chunk of Southern culture is Sunday mornings. Given many of those who practice public prayer within the Christian faith at very least, and the values we now know so many of them to embrace, embody, and embolden, public prayer comes off more as a warning. God bless you sounds more threatening, and I'll pray for you sounds almost menacing, like they're stalking you. They've got you in their sights. As you'll find out soon enough, I'm kind of anti all religions, with as much due respect as is offered. But this is my culture and the non-consensual religion of my upbringing. You see, while some might call this more leftist wokeism, I want us to look at religion and faith in a different light. We don't choose our religion of birth often. Many have grown up non-religious and sought out religion later in life. But most in this culture are born into whatever their parents were and never get any other ideas. Everything they ever know is filtered through that one lens. Every lesson learned, every subject taught, every single aspect of one's life is affected by this one major thing that we never really had a choice in, and we really never learn everything about. Consent isn't a word I'm going to focus on in this episode, but you can bet, as I deconstruct this culture of cultism, it's going to come up again. For this series, when we understand what happened to us early on and realize that we had no choice in it, that as small, helpless, vulnerable, impressionable children, desperately seeking out the love and approval all children require, people whom we trusted, loved, and depended on, delivered us into the hands of people who set out to mutilate us, brainwash us, and indoctrinate us into their ways of thinking before anyone else could influence us otherwise. That is, small, innocent, pure children. These predators groomed us, manipulated us, forced us into subservience by either guilt, obligation, or fear. Yet the Bible's first lesson is about free will. Pro-choice. Many aren't ready or willing to confront that. It's easier for us to bask in the glory and the grace and the ecstasy, breathing the ether, as they call it in the car sales business. It's that technique of, if I can get you behind the wheel of this car, feeling it on the road, and I can paint a picture of your life driving this car while you're driving this car, and I can build up that excitement without you knowing I'm building up that excitement. By the time I get you back to the showroom, I'm going to pound your bank account into the ground with the way I just made you fall in love with this car. And now you can't live without this car. I've got you. Man, I never was really good at that when I sold cars. That always made me feel bad. But that's also why I couldn't do church either. And then there we are, climbing our hills, planting our flags of opinion, ready to die on that hill. Most metaphorically, but we know now that some literally will die on that hill and are willing to kill for those opinions as well. The right side of history has become cliche. It's a phrase you'd buy a vowel to solve on Wheel of Fortune. It's not even a great cliche. In fact, in American history, as we've covered this season, and we'll cover more in future episodes, the ideological right in this country has historically and consistently been wrong. So wrong. So very, very, very wrong. But this isn't about political sides. Pen Pals was about why we do that. The series Party Crashers revealed that this division in America isn't about politics per se. It is, sort of, on the surface, but it's entirely coincidental and deliberate. Coincidental in that's just sort of how the people have been sifted and filtered politically down those lines over the years, and how polarized those two political sides, the establishments more than the people, are. Deliberate in the sense that those in power seek to cling to power and will manipulate and do whatever it takes to ensure they remain in power. So there is some truth, a lot actually, in the opinion that the powers that be pull the strings and we all pay the price. Even some validity to the claims of the media and their contributions. But today we are all the media, the social media. And that claim extends to the powers to be at those platforms too. Now, we can't do much about that now, can we? Vote or revolt, right? And so now we know there are just some psychological traits that make some people more susceptible to cultism. And we're clearing a path through that thick forest of futile feeble-mindedness to answer what it is about us that makes some capable of forsaking their own values just to be in a cult of hypocrisy. What would Jesus do, as it turned out, was just a catchy slogan, a catchphrase to sell a new trendy bracelet fad. Live strong, WWJD, cha-ching! We could trace this back throughout history, but let's understand that in the mid-1800s, there were a lot of people in this country who felt strongly enough that some people weren't people, but instead livestock, and they decided a lot of people who weren't livestock should die over that idea. Look at the cost of human life alone in the Civil War. All of those American lives lost, even the Confederate lives, if you think we should consider those, traitors that they were, I'll leave that up to you. Life. Regardless of evil or misguided intent, of pure nature of ignorance, it's still life. And so many stories ended on battlefields instead of in old age, surrounded by loved ones and legacies. Over what, really? And that's rhetorical because I'm a history nerd. I'm also a philosophy nerd. And I argue that the hills they climbed was costly on both sides. Not that it wasn't worth fighting for, abolition of slavery, of course, but even the basic principle of states' autonomy over the federal government's oversight, unless faced with a tyranny, a true tyranny, most recently known to a generation removed from our founding fathers, seems catty, to say the least. Not to minimize the other non-racism or slavery-related issues that divided America back then, if the argument is, this is worth dying over, then I ask two things. First, rephrase the proposition to, this is worth murdering over. And second, what is the number? What's the actual cost? What's the figure? Human life. How many lives will it be? You know they have the discussion in the war rooms, meetings, joint chiefs of staffs, generals, admirals, and whatnots. Even back then in our Civil War, our uncivil war, estimated losses on the battlefield. Those discussions were had and are had today. We negotiate the price before we even go in. Most of the time, the loss is underestimated. Every time, the cost is. What would have been the answer? What negotiation could have taken place to prevent the war? Historians have dissected the question, and if there was a flux capacitor, 1.21 gigawatts, and a gull-winged Sportster capable of hitting 88 on the open road, boy, maybe we could explore that. What we can say is that freeing the slaves was worth fighting for. We just shouldn't have had to fight so hard for it. Many don't like thinking about this, but this is fundamental to every other issue discussed in this episode. Every issue, period. Because this ideology, these principles and character traits, personality traits, ideas, opinions, and attitudes have been passed down for hundreds of years, generational trauma. It isn't like slavery was abolished and everybody went, yay, and a few people went, well darn, but yay for y'all. Not at all. Deep-seated resentment, anger, and entitlement. Lots of things that, when planted, may lay dormant for a while before exploding like the cancers they are. We've discussed the division of federalism and anti-federalism and how today's Federalist Society organization is actually a radical extremist group of Confederate secessionist, fascist, white evangelical nationalists. Those are all big and accusatory words, inflammatory, but accurate. This is narcissistic gaslighting in plain daylight. The Federalist Society, full of people whose ideals harken back through history as those who sought to dismantle our federal government, our Constitution, and the protections laid out for all Americans in this country and not just some Americans in some parts of some states in what used to be America. How is this selling our souls? Because I argue that we all sold our souls when we allowed all of this. Everything. Every single bit of America was built on the broken backs, broken families, and spilled blood of slaves. Not just African, mostly African, but slaves, children, women who were seen as animals by some people who saw them as animals for work or pleasure. Animals. These people saw slaves as creatures. They compromised at 3/5 of a man because some people believed they were 5/5 and some people believed they were no fifths. So we landed at 3 for a while. Selling our souls. We had the answers to the test, but we kept selling out because we needed slave labor to build it all, everything. Not just the South, the White House, everything. Every single thing in America today is owed to the African slaves who led us here to the promised land. Those non-consensually immigrated, non-consensual, unpaid working subclass who did the work we were too good or too few to do. They made up the difference in the population, but we didn't want them to count until some of us did. Then it mattered. Then we couldn't agree on why we wanted to count them. We knew the answers. But many used the Bible and its talk of slavery as justification, selling our souls. And we turn a blind eye to this discussion because it leads us to reparations. And without any clear, debatable argument that any of what I've just said is false, there is no argument against reparations, except the one that is afraid of true justice and a potential power and prosperity paradigm flip. Instead, 3/5, 40 acres and a mule that never even happened. Forgive and forget. Remember, all you have to do to be forgiven is to ask for forgiveness. Then the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crowism, and the South will rise again. It was 100 years later that America said again for the umpteenth time that all people were created equal, when liberals, now in the Democratic Party, the party a century earlier which fought really hard to keep slaves, delivered the Civil Rights Act about 60 years ago. You see, that never seems to really stick with us for some reason. We have to keep reminding ourselves over and over and over that Black Lives Matter. Why is that? How do you break down every single atrocity committed against the Black community in this country without addressing the origins and how things have never really changed? We've certainly never made amends. Amendments, sure. Even those are problematic. No amends. Meanwhile, everything in your life as an American, you owe to the slaves who laid the groundwork and built this economy for it to grow into the industrial powerhouse of innovation, opportunity, and prosperity that we have become. And if you don't acknowledge that, I'm afraid you're selling your soul. For what principle? What argument stands in your way of standing before final judgment, if that's your thing, and proclaiming that you denounced slavery wholly, and you fought for justice on that matter for the grace of God, altruistically, because you wouldn't stand to benefit from that if you look like me? So much in history, from Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who would have and should have been a brilliant representative of the people in our government, to Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Trayvon Martin, just to name the very few. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the voices we know. So many injustices in this community can all be traced back to the shame of our origins. But rather than overcompensating for what we know to be true, to accept it, acknowledge it, make it as right as we can, or more right than we have before. We don't just turn a blind eye, we turn the complete cold shoulder to it, refusing to accept it, because it risks unraveling everything, because just like everything in America is built on slavery, everything we know about our society is filtered through the lens of racial injustice, or at least unfairness. Whether we know it or not, whether we want to admit it or not. It's convenient to turn the blind eye. It's painful as hell to face it. But in recent years, with many of the race-related big stories that have come out, we've seen a trend, a shocking trend of whataboutism, deflection, justification, and rage. When something happens, let's look to someone's initial reaction. So many reactions to the story of a police officer kneeling on a man's neck for 9 minutes while that man was pleading for his life and saying he can't breathe, with such vitriol and victim blaming. Blaming the guy who died, who couldn't move or breathe for 9 minutes, with people standing around filming. Only part of this is due to how we see police in America, which I will cover in the Black and White of Back the Blue, another episode later this season which explores the origins of our attitudes and opinions on justice and policing. The other aspect of this side of that particular issue is the devaluation for some human life. Remember, just like with the war room, there is the internal negotiation, the cost-benefit analysis. What's the return on investment? What do I get out of this? In almost every major issue, there's some value that one holds above those of another person. Their opinions are formed because those values and ideals are more valuable to them than the opposition. In order to accept those hardline stances on those issues and not see the opposition as worthy of consideration, we often turn to devaluing them as humans, as people. Shifting gears to gun violence and domestic terrorism. Kyle Rittenhouse was found not guilty in a court for murder, though that human American court cannot wipe those charges from the ledger for his soul. Altruism comes into play here. I don't believe the boy's intent. I believe he went there with intent to kill and get away with it. Throughout the trial and the videos and the evidence, I saw a boy in over his head in a place he didn't belong. Nobody really did, but he particularly chose to go into there with a gun, tactical gear. There was zero wiggle room on the fact that he left his home that night with a piece of equipment whose sole purpose is to end life, or at very least terrorize others, that he crossed so many logical barriers, opportunities to change his mind, but he was set on his motivation and intent. Only he knows what that truly was in the moment, and I doubt he'd ever really be honest about it. The first opportunity that presented, Kyle took that shot. Then a few more for good measure. This scared little kid, this boy, brainwashed and indoctrinated by a culture of cultism, who never had a chance to be anything but what he was that night. This little boy who should have been anywhere else, fulfilling a purpose, ended the purpose of 2, maybe 3, fulfilling his destiny as a right-wing extremist pariah. When I see someone in public with a gun who isn't wearing a badge, I naturally assume that person is a domestic terrorist who means harm to others or themselves. We shouldn't ever assume otherwise. Assuming otherwise costs lives. Now, I'm not saying those men thought when they saw the boy with the gun, there's a domestic terrorist. I'm saying if I was in a situation like that, and I saw someone with a gun, especially like that, I would see them as a danger to everyone. Who knows if I'd have the courage in that moment to try and take them down by myself. I know if someone got hurt later and I had seen him and didn't try, that would haunt me forever. So I don't know what I would do in that situation. And I don't know what those men were thinking that night. Only they know. And Kyle Rittenhouse took their right to tell their side of the story away. He got away with that legally. Not morally, not spiritually, and neither will we, I'm afraid. It's the reaction to that story that I found spiritually unsettling. Watching it unfold, watching the evolution of excuses, I noticed that the collective immediate response was anti-riot, in that this group praised Rittenhouse for standing up for his community. Not his community, by the way. In the face of a violent riot. Violent riot with no more concern for it than just that. And forget the January 6th insurrection hypocrisy on this one for just a moment. It's that they denounced the rioting, right? They just denounced the rioting. That's fair enough. As we've discussed, protests sometimes escalate, and sometimes it's not the people protesting, but protester imposters. Many of those have been charged in these situations. So we know that's an actual thing. It's tossing all benefit of doubt out the window because their values of peace and order overruled the value of human life. Or some value did. Seeking more confirmation bias than a challenge of their ways of thinking, but morally so. They want to be right. They need to be right. So that first opinion is really hard to back down from. That becomes the starting point for most, and every opinion after builds off of that. They never really reconsider that when new information becomes available. They just double down and keep gambling, selling their souls for pride, ego. This anti-riot sentiment was before any information about the victims was released, by the way. This was in the beginning of the story. As more information began to surface and come out, the discussion on that side shifted more to defense of gun rights because many were critical of the boy even having a gun like that and being able to just carry it, shoot people, and then walk up to the police and say, "The mean man attacked me, help me, please." Lots of criticism of law enforcement and legalities, and that's when you'll see conservatives prickle up. By the time the victims were identified, conservative organizations began their investigations, and conservative media outlets began the smear campaign. Of the victims, the smear campaign of those who were killed. Again, this isn't a statement about the individuals. This is a statement about the reaction most had not knowing anything more about the individuals than a headline. In fact, they'd made up their minds before the headlines, but finding out that these victims were somehow flawed only served to justify the initial response. They felt validated. But that validation didn't come from reason, only from superficial information that may or may not have been entirely accurate. They didn't need accurate. They didn't want it. They needed to be right. Again, I'm not talking about the things we know now. I'm talking about in the hours, days, and weeks after. Many allowed their views of guns to override their God, their sense of justice over Jehovah. In their eyes, those men deserved what they got, and then some. I saw these comments on my content. I still see them. It went from devaluing the victim as a person to flat out publicly saying they got what they had coming, and good riddance. I think they just finished the sentence I asked. By God, if they come into my yard, I'll ... In showbiz, we refer to that as a callback. We hear these same arguments in shootings all the time. It's a little more difficult in mass shootings unless they're at an establishment that represents something one already devalues. In these events, opposition to a humane response would offer many points about guns and how we need more guns and more people with more guns because more bullets zipping through the air is never a bad thing, right? Those first few minutes of Saving Private Ryan, they use that as white noise to help them sleep. Pun intended. In all of these events, condemning the actions, humility for the life lost, and an earnest reconsideration of one's values would be the proper response. Maybe you end up in the same place opinion-wise, but you've at least weighed the cost to know where your soul stands. You can defend gun rights or self-defense and condemn that boy for what you know he did. Both things can be true. He shouldn't have been there. Certainly shouldn't have had the gun. He had every right to defend himself if felt threatened. And we set the legal precedent of a terrorist coming after the hero who tried to take him down and prevent a mass shooting. Nobody cares about that bigger picture stuff, right? We don't see a lot of humility. There was almost zero regard for the lives lost that night. The only lives lost that night at the hands of Kyle Rittenhouse. With marriage equality, and even abortion, rather than focusing on their own home and ensuring their values would be upheld by their children, there's a push to enforce their views on everyone. Now, we could say the same thing about the flip side, right? Here we are pushing two dudes kissing right in our faces. Most wouldn't mind if it was two chicks and they was hot. Except nobody's pushing anything in anyone's face. It's just existing in the world and wishing to exist in that world the same way everyone else gets to. For some, that's too much. Some see people living their authentic lives and it makes that person bitter and resentful for living this lie that made them not live their authentic lives. Patriarchy, purity culture, and misogyny. So much of our sexuality and relationship dynamics are set by this non-consensual relationship with this religion of our birth. What is acceptable is defined for you by someone else who doesn't accept a whole lot of things. Ego, pride, narcissism get in the way. And rather than accepting our own limitations and allowing others to live their lives, this group turns the camera on themselves, constantly shining the light as the perpetual victim. Through it all. Slavery, civil rights, abortion, marriage, any of it. Shootings, cancel culture. Those who cry about political correctness cannot comprehend it's about personal correction. It's never about accountability culture for them. It's about how we're canceling people or ideas without any deeper examination of those people or ideas. We're taking people's opportunities away when they've really done nothing wrong, is basically what they're telling us, isn't it? Brett Kavanaugh, that spoiled little brat who sexually assaulted the young woman behind the dumpster, and he got a few months in a spa or something? The right answers are in front of us. They're right in front of us. But when they condemn that kid, they have to acknowledge all the guys they know who have done creepy things or even talked about it. I've said some pretty messed up stuff. I get it. It isn't canceling Kevin Spacey to weigh how creepy we feel watching American Beauty now, or even House of Cards, and how we don't really need Kevin Spacey. Do we really need people who are problematic in those ways? In any ways? I mean, we sort of gave a pass to Michael Jackson because of the music, right? We all made our decisions about where we stand with child sexual assault allegations and child sexual predators. I Believe I Can Fly was okay, but it wasn't Beat It, right? Where are our standards for role models, after all? And we shot that out of the water in 2016. A new standard was set. The bar lowered even more. With Bill Clinton, we should have been able to say that what he did was predatory and a problematic pattern of behavior that could have very well put our national security at risk, as many tried to warn us. Many had said Clinton was like Kennedy in his insatiable lust for attention from young ladies. That compromises an important figure, makes it easier for someone to infiltrate their judgment. This should have been something we all could discuss. How using his position and power, especially when married, to exploit and use that young woman. But many blame the woman in the situation. I won't say her name. Her name's been said in relation to that man enough. But many blamed her or excused his actions. I mean, who wouldn't if somebody offered in the White House, right? In the Oval Office? We heard it. Political chess played for impeachment, to take down the popular president, a power play. In fact, had the Democratic Party condemned the action, ousted him, and let Gore take over, Gore could have certainly won in 2000. The Democrats would have seized the high ground on morality, leaving the scandals on the right in the years to come, and there would be many, to be amplified hypocrisies, rather than just the standard. Two wings of the same bird, as some say. The bird is a turkey. This is how we approach many of these Me Too movement stories. Victim blaming, excuse making, and it's solely to preserve a patriarchal, protected, and privileged people. I do believe both sides of a story are important, by the way. I believe innocent until proven guilty, by the way. But we must hear victims and create an atmosphere that's safe for someone to speak out. Because for so long and even still, we haven't been able to create that atmosphere. We know why some are afraid of creating that atmosphere. We know. Speaking of patriarchal, protected, and privileged people, victim blaming, and excuse making, let's all remember the initial reactions to the Jeffrey Epstein story. From conservatives, they were quick to admonish Bill Clinton's ties, but fast to deflect with, "The plane only flew north," when it came to Donald Trump's association with Epstein. All the while conveniently ignoring the fact that Obama had none. The correct answer was bring them all down, whomever. Pardon the poorly placed pun, but Epstein is a touchy subject for the group whose cult is centered around a guy who has made more than one inappropriate sexual comment about his own daughter. How do they condemn Epstein, or their leader, outright with no nuance, without revealing the hypocrisy of what they've chosen to ignore in their own families for generations? What does it say about the soul of someone who makes excuses for that kind of thing? In a future episode, I'll break down my journey through politics coming out of Republicanism, where I'll talk more about 9/11 and birtherism, and how these issues contributed to not only my leaving the Republican Party, but America's selling out of our soul. These are the hard moral dilemmas we faced. We shouldn't condemn all fill-in-the-blank Middle Eastern country Muslims for this, because one day we're going to wish people wouldn't blame all white evangelical patriots for fill-in-the-blank mass shooting, insurrection, governor kidnapping, vice president hanging, or domestic terror attempt, whatever. Prudence. John McCain's response to the racist old lady at the town hall in 2008 was exactly what should have united America. It almost kinda did, except that Obama was black. When she suggested Obama was something she didn't like, McCain displayed the last true act of patriotism by a Republican, well, until Liz Cheney, by saying on national live television that, well, he basically gave Barack Obama an endorsement. He gave permission for lots of centrists tired of the war and confused as hell over Palin to go vote for the guy they were kinda scared of but just needed some reassurance. We needed Papaw to tell us he was American, I guess. Because playing into birtherism is unpatriotic and suggests to our enemies that we are a country who backgrounds checks for a job at Old Navy, but not to be president or even carry a gun in some places. Some, so scared of losing an election and so angry when they did, chose to compromise America's national security with those loose lips that sink ships, telling anyone who would listen what a scam our elections are, how compromised our system is, and to our enemies who wish to plant someone in power who would do their bidding, just how easy it would be to do so. Yes, these opinion hills we climb are slippery slopes down from the moral high ground. We're almost through Selling Our Souls, the series. Now let's talk about how many Americans sold their souls the last few years. Let's talk about Trump. In my comments section, any platform, anytime I speak out about Donald Trump, I will hear some troll spew out TDS or Trump derangement syndrome. This isn't offensive or bothersome to me because them saying it isn't accusing me of having it. It's a warning that they have TDS. It's another name for Cult 45, MAGA, Republicans. They use TDS as a slam, saying we're crazy and obsessed. In fact, it's not Donald Trump who's the target of my disappointment and frustration. It's those who support him. As far as moral dilemmas go, I believe the universe has been tossing us some lobs over center plate for a while, and many of us just keep whiffing the bat. As in, we've had some pretty clear-cut quandaries in this last decade, and we've watched our friends, neighbors, and family devolve into this TDS. In fact, I'll argue that this isn't even about Donald Trump. He's a convenient figurehead. His mere presence, in their opinion, owns the libs. For a group of people obsessed with owning other people, this is a big deal. Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio, Mike Huckabee, even Paul Ryan wouldn't garner this frothing at the mouth fervor. So who would? Sarah Palin, pre-Trump Trumpette, was the prototype for Donald Trump's presidency. The GOP floated this daft clown out for the world to see and hear. It was a ploy. If they win, they have the blueprint for what works. If they lose, they need to adjust the blueprint. If Palin's looks weren't enough to get the incels to turn out in droves, they needed something more impressive than looks. They needed a demagogue. They needed Mussolini, but controllable. McCain was too nice. He gave Obama the election. He wouldn't fight as dirty as Republicans wanted. McCain brought a knife to a gunfight. Republicans needed a cannon. They got a loose one. I honestly could do an entire 5th episode of this series just on the many controversies of Donald Trump. I could present a moral dilemma for each one, showcasing how so many chose pride and ego over God. I really wanted to. Maybe later on in the season. I mean, if you know, you know. And if you don't know by now, you might be a fascist. For me, when Trump mocked the reporter, that was really the most appalling thing I'd seen from a presidential candidate in a while, if ever. It was abhorrent. I say this as someone who, in the past, has behaved in disgustingly similar manners, in telling jokes and comedy, sometimes just being a dick. I've said from the start, I'm not a good person, but it's that I know I wasn't and recognize that, which allows me to see that in others. No excuses. It's inexcusable. Our society, up until recently, has been very ableist. Everything from jokes about body shaming, health issues, disabilities, or just disadvantages. We've been really mean. We have, and we allow it in the media we consume too. And I aimed low with some jokes, at other people's expense, believe me. The laughs feel great, but the cost makes you sick. Just to say that for me, I think I'm not alone in this if anyone else is willing to admit it. If you've ever used the word unless it was in reference to suppress a flame, using the hard re at the beginning is wrong, hurtful, and insensitive. And up until recently, it was normalized. Ableism was normalized. What Trump did was normalized for so many. He did what so many have done, and we've either done it, laughed while someone else did it, or stayed silent in the face of it. We've all expected more out of someone running for president of the United States of America, or we should have. When Trump mocked that reporter, listen to the crowd. They cheered. They laughed. They agreed, because the reporter to them was dehumanized. The reporter was dehumanized and considered less than because he is afflicted with arthrogryposis. Never heard of it? Well, Serge Kovaleski lives with it, and it restricts the use of your arms. You kind of need those. But that didn't matter to hundreds in attendance and thousands, hundreds of thousands watching from home. Boo the main media! The corruption and collusion in finances, the tax records, and questionable alliances, the filling a cabinet with donors rather than experts, and his deliberate mass murder of so many Americans from his negligent response to the COVID pandemic. His placing his children in key positions in his administration to have security clearances and then go make deals with foreign entities. This wasn't a presidential administration so much as a hostile corporate takeover. All of that should have been red flags to any American, regardless of party affiliation. The fact that Trump is married to a Slovenian former nude model who has ties to Russia never even blipped the radar for these folks. And it isn't that it just didn't blip the radar. If it had been anyone on the other side, there would have been Senate hearings over investigating their background and financials. Not here. From defending the size of his manhood on a political debate stage to showing us what he thinks about military service and veterans over and over, from his mockery of John McCain and attacking a Gold Star vet's family. Good people on both sides. We love you, to his insurrectionist army. To the Mexican judge. Remember that racist scandal? To paying off a porn star with campaign funds, so she would keep quiet about him paying her $10,000 to have sex with him while First Lady OnlyFans recovered from delivering Barron. I mean, we're not even to Twitter yet, or the election fraud claims, the treason. His remarks about Rosie O'Donnell, Megyn Kelly, and countless other women, and the many cases of sexual assault allegations, the crass and horrendous remarks he made on his television shows, which you can't find digitally anywhere now. His feelings on women are well known. The Access Hollywood tape should have been the final straw, but for some, they excused those actions away. And the way Donald Trump has repeatedly over the years objectified and sexualized his daughter, even with her in his presence, didn't seem alarming or concerning. Back to the Epstein deflection. When any reasonable person would have heard a father basically say he wishes he could have sex with his own daughter, they would have said, "Time out!" What? And that would have been the end of it. Instead, this group of people so hell-bent on winning and getting their way and apparently determined to normalize what Donald Trump wants to do to his daughter, so it's normalized, and people don't think it's weird that they want to do that to their kids too. I can't even make sense of it. That one factor alone really should have been the thing. Actually, there have been hundreds of the things with Trump. So the derangement syndrome certainly is real, but it's narcissism and sociopathy, and it is a cult. And it's the diagnosis for the 75,222,000 plus Americans. Nobody's perfect, many defenders of his actions would say. Only Jesus was perfect. Seems an odd way to tie love thy neighbor and grab him by the putty tat. Repeatedly throughout the man's candidacy, campaign, and presidency, there was opportunity after opportunity for these Americans to stand up and say enough. Instead, they compromised their values, sold out their souls, and voted for the worst candidate in the history of American politics. Historically, only two presidents are worse, and those are the two who bookended the Civil War. Oh, this will be on the internet forever. Bookended the first Civil War. Americans turned their backs on Jesus, the Bible, and every sense of decency, morality, ethics, character, and integrity, all just to own the libs and win. Selling out every single value they say they hold dear, while putting ideals like guns, freedom, states' rights, sanctity of marriage, saving the unborn cell clumps, not getting treaded upon, and winning an election no matter what, all above God. They put their rights and freedoms above their God when they were simply asked to wear a mask in public and not take any chances catching a virus or spreading it to others who might catch it. These aren't hard decisions. I feel like they're getting easier and easier almost. Like the universe is getting really frustrated, out of patience with us, desperate for us to show any signs of evolution, actual civilization, and hope for a future before Armageddon snuffing us out in another big bang, a reset, a universal Control-Alt-Delete. We talk about how during the civil rights movement, there were all these people in these photos. These people are still alive today, throwing things at children who were just seeking to go to school, shouting, spitting, harassing people at hate rallies. We have these historical records of their faces, their angry, hateful, much younger faces. Those people today are someone's grandparents' parents. Just as with Richard Nixon's corruption and the Watergate scandal, many parents and grandparents voted in those elections. Some of your family voted to put Nixon in office. Some may have even voted for him a second time. Some may have even still voted for Republicans in the election after all that, with no further thought. In fact, there were a lot of people, more than history wants to remember, who supported Nixon even after it came out. People stood by Nixon and thought he did nothing wrong, or at least it wasn't that bad. Those opinions and ideas are not forgotten. Well, they are if they're not logged. Today, with social media, there are more monuments to our opinions than ever before. Every Facebook post, Instagram share, Snapchatted, Twittered, and TikToked, your tube is filled with content, ideas, and memories. I wonder sometimes, how would my dad feel about things today? I would hope that the love and compassion that I knew of my dad and his faith might lead him to seeing things more the way I do. But what I remember and know of my father leads me to believe that he would be flying a MAGA flag at a rally without a mask, even though he's on dialysis. Well, he'd be dead now anyway. 15 years of dialysis in his shape would... Bygones. Either way, I wonder. But I think I know. Your kids, your grandchildren, they'll know for sure. There'll be no denying what you stood for and where you were, which side of history you were on. Think about that. Do you know how your ancestors voted or what their beliefs were on important subjects and issues of the day? The photo albums full of Polaroids with dates and names illegibly scribbled on them gave way to feeds and For You pages. Delete those accounts. Maybe you get it all. Do we consider the epitaphs we'll leave behind when we're gone? When we climb these hills of opinion? The cost of our legacies if we've gambled, and we lose if we've sold our souls. Now that we've discussed some of the ways we've gotten it wrong over the years, I'm going to come clean about how wrong I've been. Coming up in Finding Faith, I'm deconstructing my own spirituality and how I was brought up. I'm breaking down everything from the silly religious cliches we use every day to how our spiritual self-esteem impacts our religious choices and our opinions. I'll dig deep into some of the ways we've gaslight ourselves and dispel some of the little lies we tell ourselves to feel better, about how horrible we all can be. Then, in Deconstructing a Deity, I'm looking at the religions of the world, breaking them down bit by bit, and seeking to answer more how we're similar than how we're different. These upcoming episodes are essentially about my own personal deconstruction journey and how I arrived at the conclusions I have about, everything. Everyone's story is different, but by sharing them, we give power to others to stand up and speak out. And again, even if you're an atheist or anti-theist, this series is about the deeper human spirituality and morality that we can all agree on. I'm getting personal, maybe private, but I'm hoping to challenge the way you see things as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got everything organized in playlists for you. I've got some of my music organized in a playlist. I've got all my Overthinking Everything episodes, my TikToks, and some of the goofy parody videos I've done. Like, share, and subscribe. Do everything I need you to do to help this channel grow, and follow me everywhere there is to follow me. And if you like this, consider a donation on Cash App or subscribe to Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm Overthinking Everything.